So with the IRS update yesterday on the moratorium, they broke out the claims that they have in queue into three main categories. The first one is really high risk, obviously erroneous claims. The second one were ones that have an unacceptable level of risk, and they put that at 60 to 70% of the queue. And then on the very bottom, they said 10 to 20% are an acceptable level of risk. Now, as a tax practitioner, I really wanted more detail from them on what did they use to determine the risk, what's considered high risk, what's not. But I think for people who haven't dealt in this program, something that's a relevant piece of information is, well, what does the IRS actually see when you go to file one of these claims? Because unless you're somebody that's been doing this, you wouldn't really know what the IRS actually gets for information. And because they're saying, oh, this is an extremely complex credit, it's difficult for us to administrate it just because of the complexity, I want to point out something here that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, and a bit of this smoke show that's going on with the IRS. So this is a 941X. This is a sample one. This is the form that's typically used to file for an employee retention credit claim. You do one for each quarter that the company is eligible for, and it is a paper filing, so it has to be printed out, stapled, mailed to the IRS. A human being has to unstaple it, scan it, and that's how it gets processed. So that's a big part of the mess here, is that process. But I want to show you, what does the IRS actually see when you go to claim one of these? So at the top here, you get the company's name, EIN, et cetera, what quarter they're filing for, a couple of certifications of things for, why you're doing the amendment. Then on the second page, you've got the non-refundable portion of the credit, which is just related to, you calculate the whole credit, and then it's broken out between a certain portion is just towards the payroll taxes, and then a certain portion is just a credit for the wages, and it's, it adds up to the total amount of the credit. So here's, 14,000 is coming from the non-refundable portion. On the next page, 27 is coming from the refundable portion. So the total credit that's being requested here is 42,000. Not a huge claim in terms of an ERC, not a huge population of people, because we're talking about a wage base, which this is one of the only figures that they get reported to them. The qualified wages that are being used for this is 51,000. And then we've got some wages that are coming from the previous period. But beyond that, that's all the IRS is getting in terms of a standardized piece of information to them around what the client's claiming and how they're justifying that is just the amount of wage base that's used. So it gives no information about how they determined eligibility, et cetera. Now there's an opportunity on the box on the back for giving a detailed explanation of how you determined your corrections, but there was no guidance given to the tax profession of what should be in there. And on top of that, because this is a paper tax return, you need a human being to look at this, and it's going to be in a non-standard format to make the determination of whether or not they think a claim is eligible. And for most tax professionals, because there were no standards given of, we need you to attach copies of how you determined that you were qualifying under gross receipts declines, which would have been a reasonable request, or copies of government orders that were used, or anything else, which, beyond the fact that this had to be submitted to a human being to look at it, there's no information for them to be able to determine whether or not a claim is legitimate just based on this wage base and how much credit they're asking for. Now, you can find ones that are obviously erroneous, because if the client, if the taxpayer in question is filing for a wage base that is nowhere near what was filed on the original 941, then obviously you've got a fraudulent situation going on there. But there's no information that the IRS has internally that's coming from the client that's going to explain their potential eligibility. Because even things like the way that this testing works, where you look at the gross receipts or you look at the government impacts, they don't have that information, because on the gross receipts side, it's a quarterly test, and they don't have quarterly data. And on the government restriction side, they have an NAICS code that tells you what kind of organization the company is, but it's such a facts and circumstances test, it's really hard for them to tell. Now, there are certain bright line big things, like, if you have a law firm in Florida that's filing for all 6 quarters and their annual receipts are up, it's unlikely that they're going to qualify, right? They're going to have higher risk. But the IRS really doesn't have internal data that's going to be able to pinpoint that in any meaningful way, just because this is what they're looking at. It's just a couple of numbers of adjustments. It's just a wage base. And then there's no standardized way for them to ask for the gross receipts declines or how they qualified under government restrictions. There's no way for them to know that information. And so that's why this is such a problem, and that's why these risk pools are so high, is because they just don't have the information. So I don't think it's, in the update that they gave, they were saying, it has an unacceptable risk, the claim has, but really what should be emphasized here is not that it's an unacceptable level of risk, it's that they have an unacceptably low amount of data on these claims because they didn't ask for it. That's the real problem. So until the IRS can get more information and do it in a way that's a standardized process, this is going to continue to be a huge boondoggle for them, because you're going to have human beings looking through all of these and doing these facts and circumstances testing unless they get more information in a standardized way from people who did these filings. And it's the same thing on the audit inspections, right? Because how do you know whether or not a claim is legitimate if that's all you're looking at? It's really hard to tell. Now, some of the outliers are going to be very obvious for people who just, way too high claims based on their industry or based on their location. You can kind of flag some of those risks, and you can certainly triangulate some of that data. But we're talking about 1.5 million returns. How long is that going to take? If you have one person spending 10 minutes on this, multiply that by 1.5 million. How many man hours is that? It's insane. So this is something I just wanted to highlight, because I think unless you do this, you wouldn't be aware of kind of a little bit of the smoke and mirrors that are going on here.